Paris in the last half of the 19th century, the city and its people were on the move. Parisians crowded into carriages and coaches to explore glamorous new boulevards carved out of ancient neighborhoods, peered down from balloons at one of the most modernized cities in the world, gazed up at a fantastic new tower of steel, gasped in awe at the wonder of electric light, glided into world's fairs to thrill to the promise of a new age, and poured into the city's official salons and galleries to see the latest art, only to find paintings and sculptures that could have been created any time in the last 300 years. Art that reflected none of the energy and innovation they saw outside on the streets, that depicted myths and legends that had nothing to do with their lives and glorified the past. But all of that was about to change, because in Paris, some passionate young artists were about to rise up in revolt.
Artists realized that they could be free to express an individual vision, a personal vision that came from within.
We look for that now. We expect art to be new, to be edgy, to defy the past.
It opened up possibilities for 20th century artists to continue to explore even to this day.
By the time the artists declared victory in their rebellion, nothing about art or the way we see our modern world would ever be the same again. Paris, 1855. A proud city invited the world to a great fair to see the best that French art and industry had to offer. But one radical young painter had his own ideas about the kind of works that deserved to be included. His name was Gustave Courbet.
Courbet is a man who loves both ambiguity and the barroom. A man who would paint pictures that could be read on many levels and who made wonderful, outrageous kinds of statements and held court at many of the cafes in Paris.
One of Courbet's favorite topics in the cafes was the sorry state of French art. He had illustrated his contempt for the painting of his time in this self-portrait he called A Portrait of a Fanatic.
Of a man disillusioned with the stupidities that have served as his education, and who seeks to establish himself according to his own principles.
Now, Courbet was about to challenge everything the organizers of the World's Fair believed about art. These traditionalists, known as academics, clung to old ideas about art and celebrated artists like Jean-Léon Gérôme, who used their skills to create beautiful but irrelevant paintings of perfect people posed in idealized worlds.
Courbet, referred to as the father of realism, believed that painting should in fact imitate the world. He says, I've never painted an angel because I've never seen one.
The academics believed that for art to be worthwhile, it should be uplifting. It should represent a world better than the world of reality that people are surrounded with. Their concept of this ideal world was rooted in the art of the past, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks.
But Courbet knew that the age of the ancient Greeks was long gone. He looked around to see a world that was changing fast and not always for the better.
Courbet saw himself as a revolutionary. He saw himself as carrying the burden of the artist who stands outside of society and tries to be able to make commentary upon it.
His political commitments had always been pretty far left of center. For him, that was inseparable from his role as an artist. He felt that his art had political effect as well.
Courbet's political and artistic idealism drove him to get out of his studio and into the real world, to rub shoulders with the people of France and start to paint them in ways that revealed the truth about their lives. Courbet declared his realistic agenda to the world in a painting he called The Stonebreakers.
The Stonebreakers was directly linked to the economic reality of the time. People would have understood that these laborers were creating raw material for the building of roads, and in particular railroads. Courbet was painting them in a way that gave them a very powerful physical presence. They were basically life-size, and so his audience failed to distinguish between art and reality. They were so blown away by this picture that seemed so visually real and also specifically contemporary that, you know, they thought that they were having their noses rubbed in smelly, dirty reality.
And Courbet was just getting started. Next, he set out to shock people even more by taking the massive scale and powerful symbols of academic history painting and using them to depict a subject from everyday life. The finished work was 10 feet tall and over 21 feet long. He called it A Burial at Ornans.
Many people found this picture to be enormously offensive. First and foremost, they thought that Courbet couldn't paint. He had very little compositional aptitude. His use of color was extraordinarily limited, and the paint was applied with a kind of matte-like thickness that seemed as if he was really quite incapable of manipulating his brushes. In addition, and this was particularly offensive, people in the picture, and I love this actually, people in the picture were not paying attention. There are people looking around. There's a small boy in the foreground who's looking up rather uneasily at the large men holding this casket. There are people who are wandering out of the scene. There are people who are therefore not participating in what is supposed to be a religious event. So what Courbet does is he attacks, compromises, undercuts all of the formal tactics that art was supposed to use and the kind of subjects that art was supposed to stand on.
One critic wrote that Courbet was making a place for himself in French painting the way that a cannonball lodges itself in a wall. By the time Courbet arrived at the 1855 World's Fair to submit his work, the academic jurors had already had their fill of this rabble-rousing artist and his radical new art.
He did submit works, and he said they could accept whatever they wanted, and they did accept some, but they did not accept the larger works. For example, A Burial at Ornans was not accepted. So Courbet decided to set up his own exhibition in a temporary building just across from the fairgrounds on a piece of land that he was able to rent.
Courbet filled his temporary gallery with 40 of his most uncompromising works and created the art world's first one-man show. At its center, he hung a massive painting of himself at work in his studio.
He shows himself at the center in front of a canvas painting a landscape, but he is surrounded by many figures. To the right are his friends and supporters. To the left are figures who represent the old world, the old ideologies, and the kind of the chaos or the disorganization of them. The Studio of the Painter is a key work because through it, Courbet wanted, I think, to establish and to define the artist's role in society.
To be able to translate the customs, the ideas, the appearance of my times, according to my own judgment. To be not only a painter, but a man as well. In short, to create a living art. Such is my goal.
Some say it was in this moment that the concept of the modern artist as a rebel was born.
When I'm dead, let this be said of me. He belonged to no school, no church, no institution, no academy, least of all to any regime but that of liberty.
But when Courbet's radical politics angered a new right-wing government, he would be forced to flee to Switzerland and spend his final years in exile. Still, he never stopped painting, never stopped speaking out for the political and artistic ideals he had championed for so long.
Courbet's legacy was to insist and serve as a model for the notion of artistic freedom, to express oneself as an individual whose vision is of value to others, rather than a vision predetermined by the academic framework.
But the academics' grip on the art world had not yet been broken, so the art rebellion would go on. With Courbet in exile, a new generation of rebels would take up his fight for artistic freedom and make it their own. Artists like Edouard Manet, one of Courbet's first followers, who was already gaining fame for creating shockingly realistic and provocative works of art. Edgar Degas, an aristocrat who was just beginning to celebrate modern life in beautiful pictures of jockeys and laundresses, ballet dancers, and prostitutes. Auguste Renoir and Claude Monet, two young friends developing radical new ways to depict fleeting impressions of light on objects in the real world. Their compatriots, Bert Morisot, Camille Pissarro, Mary Cassatt, Alfred Sisley, and Paul Cézanne, a rough painter from Provence who talked less than almost anyone else in the group, but would do the most to change the way we think about art. Today, these men and women are famous as the founders of the world's first modern art movement. But in 1874, they had a serious problem. The same academics who had refused to show Courbet's paintings still ran the annual state-sponsored salons, the only chances French artists had to get their work seen.
The salon was the place for artists to make a reputation and ultimately to make a living. It was a supermarket for art, thousands of pictures, and would attract hundreds of thousands of people during the course of its run, which were many months. There were no newspapers at the time that really had the kind of graphics that we have today. There was no television, there was no radio to be talking about these things, so the visual arts gained its greatest prominence from this annual salon. Everybody wanted to participate in the salon. It was the way in which, in the end, you were going to go into history or be forgotten.
Year after year, the academics who ran the salons refused to show the art being created by Monet, Renoir, and the other radical young painters. So in 1874, the frustrated artists decided to take matters into their own hands. If no one else would show their work for them, they would do it themselves. They rented an empty building on the fashionable Boulevard des Capucines, covered the walls with their paintings, and threw open the doors to the world's first group show of modern art.
The 1874 exhibition, the first of 8 they would do, is absolutely a watershed in the history of modern painting. It was young painters coming together to create an independent venue for their art to be seen by the public. They were circumventing the salon system for selling their art, for judging their art. It was a huge turning point in the history of modernism.
But some felt it was a turn in the wrong direction. Change was sweeping through Paris at a dizzying pace. The traditions of academic art seemed like one of the last links to a way of life that was vanishing fast. For critics like Ernest Chénaud of the Paris Journal, this new art was as hard to understand as the new world it depicted.
From a distance, this stream of life, this great shimmering of light and shade must be saluted as a masterpiece. As you approach, everything vanishes. All that remains is an indecipherable chaos of palette scrapings.
Chénaud and other critics weren't just dismayed by individual paintings. They were bewildered by the wide range of styles on display in the show. Reporter Jules Castanieri saw just one common element that tied all the works together.
If one wishes to characterize and explain them with a single word, then one would have to coin the word Impressionists. They are Impressionists in that they do not render a landscape, but the sensation produced by the landscape.
Even though the artists hadn't picked the name, history would remember them as the Impressionists.
Impressionism is an umbrella term because it meant something different for each painter. It was not a single aesthetic. It celebrated a freedom of vision, a singularity of vision. It celebrated the fact that each painter could develop their own style and in time, in fact, their own range of subject matter. And these painters defined themselves by their freedom from formulas.
But in the 1870s, this freedom from formulas offended Parisians accustomed to the traditional values of academic art.
Today, Impressionist art is the most popular in the world. Can't get enough of Impressionism. In the 1870s, it was a very different story. People looked at the art and found it to be offensive.
The Impressionist works were shocking, especially to traditionalists, because they looked unfinished.
Impressionism took as its premise that you could make a work of art without pre-planning or without great deal of forethought. Most works of art required all kinds of preparatory drawings and compositional sketches. The Impressionists instead felt that the direct mark upon the canvas was both more honest and more vital.
The brushstroke became a sort of signature. You can identify a Monet brushstroke and distinguish it from a Renoir brushstroke or a Degas, and certainly from a Cézanne. So every facet of an Impressionist painting celebrates their individuality, their freedom.
These artists had discovered a whole new way of seeing the world. A revolutionary use of color was at the heart of their vision.
The reason the color is so important is because of light. Light is the condition of all seeing, whereas drawing and, for example, mathematical perspective were conventions that were taught at the academy. We see through light and we see in color. And so translating what one sees through color is the way that the Impressionists operated.
The Impressionists didn't just revolutionize the way artists operated. They forever changed the way art would be judged and shown, and transformed our expectations about what it should be.
Within a decade, the salon would be dead. And the cult of originality becomes entrenched. Before this period, there was not such a great emphasis upon something new, something different, something defiant even. We look for that now. We expect art to be new, to be edgy, to defy the past. We look for that. We focus on and celebrate and honor that sense of originality.
The academics had finally been overthrown, but nothing stays new forever. By the 1890s, the Impressionists no longer defined art's cutting edge in Paris. Their beautiful paintings were becoming part of the city's cultural landscape. Only one of the former radicals was still making work that could surprise and shock. And most Parisians never had a chance to see his work. A decade earlier, Paul Cézanne, the rough artist from Provence, had turned his back on the city and set off on a solitary mission to create his own revolutionary new art.
He was dissatisfied with Impressionism. He realized he was pursuing a very different vision. With this broken Impressionist brushstroke, the objects that he painted began to dissolve. They became fragile, and he wanted to retain a sense of solidity he found lacking in many Impressionist paintings.
By the early 1890s, Cézanne was spending most of his time wandering the hills near his hometown of Aix-en-Provence, painting and repainting the same scenes over and over again. He was struggling to find a new way to build his paintings, stroke by stroke, from the canvas up.
The eye is not enough. Thought is also required. I had resolved to work on in silence till the day when I should feel able to defend the result of my experiments.
Cézanne did not want to simply recreate what he saw in nature. He wanted to find in painting, in the tactile structure of painting, a reflection of the order, the beauty, sometimes the tranquility, sometimes the drama of nature itself.
But realizing this vision never came easy for Cézanne.
He constantly is complaining about not being able to have the ability to render what he felt, and feeling and meaning being so central to his work.
Cézanne's quest for meaning would drive him to produce some of the most powerful paintings in the history of Western art.
He wanted to make of Impressionism something solid and durable like the art of museums. He wanted to make Impressionism something that could hang in the Louvre.
Cézanne declared that once he had achieved his elusive goal, he would return to astound Paris with an apple. But his single-minded pursuit of his vision kept him out of the art world's spotlight for over 15 years. It became almost impossible for Parisians to see his paintings. The few who did were stunned by what Cézanne had achieved during his solitary years in Provence.
The ways in which he constructed his pictures are really quite powerful and complex and challenging. The still lifes in particular, where apples and other fruits are turning towards each other or turning away from each other or occupying almost dangerous positions in tilting planes, or where the floor itself is going to be tipped up in a kind of radical fashion that challenges the notion of single-point perspective, and the way that Cézanne is able to warp those spaces. And on top of that, he's able to capture the essence of these forms, even though you see them as these painted, applied patches. It was really a remarkable kind of combination of talent that he embodied, and which these contemporaries and younger generations admired greatly.
Outside of this small circle of devoted admirers like Claude Monet, Paul Gauguin, and Vincent van Gogh, Cézanne had become painting's forgotten man. But that was about to change. By the mid-1890s, Parisians were getting used to seeing unusual views of their world. Now they would get a chance to see how Paul Cézanne had reimagined his own world on canvas. In 1895, pioneering gallery owner Ambroise Vollard staged a one-man show spanning 25 years of Cézanne's work that would change the history of art forever.
Vollard's exhibition of Cézanne's work in 1895 was a watershed point again for Cézanne. It meant everything to him, and it would change his critical fortunes for the rest of his life.
Even Cézanne's old friend Camille Pissarro was stunned by the variety and power of the 150 works on display in Vollard's gallery.
The collectors are stupefied. They don't understand anything about it. But nevertheless, he is a first-class painter of astonishing subtlety, truth, and classicism.
Cézanne had kept his promise to astound Paris with an apple. But his old doubts continued to plague him. Before the show had even opened, he was already back in Provence, back at work. For the next 10 years, he would continue his struggle to bring his unique vision to life.
I have sworn to die painting, rather than waste away with the debasing paralysis which threatens old men.
Picasso once said, "It's Cézanne's anxiety that enthralls us." There's a wonderful letter he writes to Vollard, and he says, "I am like the great Hebrew leader, Moses. I can see the promised land, but I don't know if I will ever enter."
The work Cézanne produced in those final years continued to push the boundaries of art and to exert an ever greater influence on the artists of the next generation.
My field is 19th century art, and so I try to present Cézanne as kind of a culmination of the 19th century. But I think it's quite legitimate to see him also as the beginning of the 20th century and abstraction.
He was a huge shadow over everything that happened. It is through the lens of Cézanne's art and of the painters who imitated his style that much of 20th century art was viewed.
Cézanne is often said to be the father of 20th century art, certainly the father of Cubism. If he ever saw a Cubist picture, I think he would have had great difficulty with it. But he was an artist who took the basic elements of art, line, color, shape, form, space, surface, and renewed them, twisted them, turned them, gave them the kind of mystery that they deserved, for one, and opened up possibilities for 20th century artists to continue to explore even to this day.
But Cézanne wasn't pleased when younger artists tried to cast him as the source of their own art. He knew that the art rebellion had been fought for the right to be free, not to follow.
If they try to create a new school in my name, tell them they have never understood, never loved what I have done.
From now on, all that would matter was the power of each artist's own imagination. The final battle in the art rebellion of the 19th century had been won. And the art rebellions of the 20th century, led by new visionaries like Georges Braque and Pablo Picasso, were just about to begin.